Please join me in welcoming Sam Friedman to the stage.
Thank you, Lisa. Theresa May told us in her maiden speech as Prime Minister that Britain must become the world's great meritocracy, that this is the primary means to address society's burning injustices. But in 2019, is getting ahead in Britain really just a matter of merit? Well, having spent the last 5 years researching who gets in and who gets on in Britain's elite occupations, my answer, I'm afraid, is a resounding no. Our class backgrounds continue to cast a very long shadow over our career trajectories, and to put it bluntly, it quite literally pays to be privileged. Now, what I want to do in the next 15 minutes is to explain how I've reached that conclusion, and crucially, what we might do to address it. Perhaps the first question to address is, how do we actually measure a person's class background? This is a tortured and an important question. The truth is there's no undisputed way, but here we use the most established single indicator. That's a person's parental occupation when they were growing up. And based on answers to this, we can then organize people's class origins into 3 broad groups. First, those whose parents did professional and managerial work, middle-class jobs, you might call them. Second, those whose parents did lower middle class or skilled manual jobs, shop owners, electricians, etc. And finally, those whose parents did solidly working class, routine jobs, cleaners, labourers, or didn't work at all. And once we can do this, we can then look, as we do here, at how origins correspond to people's destinations in terms of the jobs they themselves do. So this rather pretty, but also rather depressing picture of the overall flows in the UK, drawing on representative data from about 100,000 people in Britain's largest employment survey, the Labour Force survey, shows you sort of how backgrounds affect destinations in the UK. But you'll notice that our destination groups are slightly different, as we're particularly interested in those in the right-hand corner, those who reach elite jobs. And here I'm defining elite jobs as both higher professional and managerial occupations, lawyers, doctors, engineers, but also we add a set of cultural professions, journalism, film and television, that are, if not more competitive than the traditional professions, and which wield significant cultural influence. But of course, these jobs are not in and of themselves all the same. I hope you can see this here, but this shows you the social composition of each of these top jobs in the UK in terms of those from each of those 3 origin groups. And you see real diversity here, from the tremendous exclusivity of somewhere like medicine, where only 6% are from working class backgrounds, to the relative openness of professions like engineering. But a key question is, what happens when people actually enter these jobs? Who gets on? Well, the answer to this, as I mentioned, is that it pays to be privileged. Those from working class backgrounds in these elite jobs face a very significant class pay gap. About £6,500 a year, or 16%, compared to their colleagues from professional or managerial backgrounds in the same jobs. And significantly, and I think this is really important to make clear, this is particularly acute for certain groups, particularly acute, as you can see here, for women from working class backgrounds who face a very clear double disadvantage. They earn, as you can see here, on average £19,000 a year less than men from privileged backgrounds in the same jobs. You see a similar double disadvantage for most socially mobile black and minority ethnic professionals in the UK. Perhaps the most important thing to note about this class pay gap, though, is that it remains significant even when we adjust for a range of indicators of merit, of education, hours worked, person's training, and their level of experience. So this is sort of worth underlining, I think, to frame our discussion today. Even when those from working class backgrounds are similar to their advantaged colleagues in every way we can measure, they still earn significantly less. But what about you guys specifically? What about television? For me, social mobility is especially crucial in this industry. You guys are responsible for producing the culture, the stories that shapes how Britain sees itself. So it's pivotal that you as a workforce represent the diversity of your audiences. So in the last year or so, I and others have been working with a range of broadcasters to compile the first sort of comprehensive picture of what the sector looks like. And as Lisa mentioned, this chart shows you pretty simply that TV is pretty posh. 60 or 70% of staff at each of the main broadcasters and in the indie sector are from professional and managerial middle-class backgrounds. The figure in the population as a whole is 31%. Next, and perhaps more worrying, we also find a very clear class ceiling in television. This graph shows you the class composition of senior management across the TV sector, notably in most cases and pretty markedly at Channel 4, the proportion of those from socially mobile backgrounds drops off considerably as you reach the top echelons. Just a few % of top Channel 4 staff are from working class backgrounds. So the obvious question then is why, right? What's driving this class ceiling? To get at this, we realized we needed to move beyond statistics, beyond survey data. So we brokered access to a number of elite firms. We conducted about 175 interviews at a large multinational accountancy firm, a successful architecture practice. We also spoke to self-employed actors, and we also went inside, as you probably know by now, Channel 4. And I just want to pull out briefly 3 main drivers that emerged from these interviews. Okay, drivers don't seem to be appearing here, but you don't need the slides. First of all, I found clear economic barriers. To get ahead in TV, particularly in what is often called the creative route, you need to negotiate a string of precarious, poorly paid, short-term production jobs that then give you the experience to reach higher executive positions. But many from lower socioeconomic backgrounds explained to us in interviews that they simply didn't have the economic resources, the luxury of the bank of mum and dad to follow this route. And therefore what they had done was sort of grudgingly self-select out to more stable but less lucrative areas, to admin, to sales, to marketing, or to more technical routes. But it's not just about money. I also detected strong social barriers, in particular a culture of informal sponsorship, whereby senior individuals fast-track the careers of sponsees, but crucially tend to establish relationships with those who they feel a kind of cultural affinity, who they recognise. And that tends to mean, when those at the top are from privileged backgrounds, a sort of reproduction of the advantage. Finally, there are also cultural barriers. I think this is a really, perhaps the most interesting area. There's a lot to say, but I'm just going to pick up on one thing, a powerful behavioural code that I detected in television, which we termed studied informality. Now, behavioural codes are important in many professions, but they're often relatively formal and sort of pivot across clear expectations about dress, speech, and appearance. Think about the idea of corporate polish, for example. In television, this idea of polish holds little sway, right? Most people told me that they had chosen television precisely because there weren't formal expectations around dress and appearance, that the culture was informal, that this was a key sign of television's openness. But the more I delved into this, the more I began to understand it's not really a social leveler at all. On the contrary, it constitutes often a very subtle and intricate code. 2 key dimensions of this idea of studied informality. First, it requires a particular package of self-presentation, casual but hip dress. There was a lot of discussion throughout my interviews about the right kind of trainers. And knowing often ironic humour. Who knows when to swear in meetings? Who knows when to put their feet up on the desk? Who knows when to mock their managers? Who knows when that's appropriate? And also a level of interpersonal familiarity, hugs and kisses rather than handshakes, that are not normally associated with the professional workplace, right? Secondly, it involves a sort of particular intellectual or highbrow way of talking about television, particularly we found in commissioning at Channel 4, and perhaps even where you know, what's needed is to be able to sort of drop cultural references, often from other high art forms, or to speak in a sort of lyrical tone. And the point here is that even though most of the people told us in anonymous interviews that actually these types of references were fairly irrelevant to the types of programs being made, unsurprisingly, it was those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds that found this norm, this behavioural code, particularly alienating and intimidating, who struggled to master studied informality, who just didn't seem to understand the rules of the game, as one interviewee said. And this matters, in my mind anyway, because it sort of demonstrates how the self-presentational baggage of a privileged class origin is frequently misrecognised in television as a marker of a person's talent, ability, or fit. So how do we break this class ceiling? My things are working now. In the book, we've tried to come up with a number of ideas. I'm just going to take you through 5 or 6, and we'll leave the whole 10 up for discussion. The first step for organisations, we argue in the book, is to nail measurement, okay, to properly measure and monitor the socioeconomic backgrounds of their staff, to then look at whether they too have a class ceiling, and then crucially, to be bold and publish this data, as Channel 4 has bravely done, to own it in public. Here we would also stress organisations should think intersectionally. People's work lives are clearly affected by multiple axes of identity that often work together. So let's properly examine this. How specifically do women and people of colour from working class backgrounds get on? And how might that inform our interventions? So data, that's the easy bit, but we also want to push organisations further in 3 ways. First, to formalise the informal, to tighten formal procedures around hiring and promotions. So in terms of something like sponsorship, it's simply harder for senior figures to fast-track their favourites. Second, we'd call upon a ban on unpaid and unadvertised internships. These tilt so clearly unfairly towards those who can rely upon the bank of mum and dad. And thirdly, I think we think it's time that lots of different employers begin to have a conversation with their staff about what actually the word talent or merit actually means. Our work shows that in areas like TV, what it takes to be good at your job is actually quite contested. And the competencies valued by those at the top are not necessarily shared by those they work with. So let's open this up, let's debate it, and consequently what we might end up with is a more transparent and crucially a more widely agreed upon notion of what merit looks like in TV. Finally, I just want to finish with this quote from one of our respondents. It's not his real name, but it's Mark. Mark was a very successful commissioner at Channel 4. But what was really interesting was his acknowledgement that his rapid upward trajectory had been sort of contingent on starting the race with what he called, with a series of sort of profound advantages. As he says here, it's not like I think I'm rubbish. I mean, I've seen lots of peers with greater networks and privilege screw up because they just weren't good enough. But at the same time, it's sort of mad to pretend there's not been an incredibly strong following wind throughout my career. Now, this idea of a following wind, a gust of privilege, gets to the heart, really, of what our book is about. It neatly captures, we think, the subtle propulsive power provided by an advantaged background, how it acts as an energy-saving device that allows some to get further with less effort, deftly shaping career trajectories, delineating what courses of action are possible, what kind of support is available, and how one's merits are perceived by others. Equally, the metaphor visualizes the experience of the upwardly mobile, who often have the wind against them. And our main point, really, is that when the following wind of privilege is misread as merit, the inequalities that result are legitimized. Thank you.
Begin, because we've got loads to get through, to say I'm really delighted. I was going to say to see so many of you here, but I literally can't see any of you. It's so dark out there. But I am delighted that you've turned up to talk about what I think is such an important issue. And it's important for all of us, whether you have skin in the game in terms of your background or not. I think Sam's research confirms what I think many people would recognise, now, that the media is still a very, very difficult club to get into if you're not from one of those privileged backgrounds, as he's discussed. And critically, even once you get in, it's equally, if not more difficult, to get on. It's something that I've been really interested in for a very long time. I remember when I started work, I remember being in a newsroom where there would be this fantastic unnamed character who would constantly drop in a smattering of Latin, just in, as you do, in the chats. Or, more recently, I was at a work-related do with lots of people from different organisations, where I was in a group where somebody said, oh, you were from X college, and he said, yes, and you were from such and such college, and they weren't talking about Southgate Tech. And it's not to say that there is anything wrong with the wonderful people who come out of those colleges or who are privately educated. It is, for me, an issue of fairness and about how do we represent Britain. Anyway, that's too much from me already, but I'm in telly, so I tend to chat rather too much myself. I hope you like the microphone. Sam and me are going to do islands in the stream after this. So let me begin. Sam looked very alarmed there. Has no idea what I'm talking about. By welcoming our panel and saying thanks very much to all of you for joining us today. Dr. Louise Ashley is a senior lecturer in organisation studies at Royal Holloway University of London. She specialises in researching the development of diversity and inclusion programmes in large multinational professional services firms so that we're able to compare in perhaps a more formal environment how this works. Tracy Brabin is the MP for Batley and Spen and the Shadow Minister for Early Years. Tracy co-authored Acting Up, the Labour Party's inquiry into access and diversity in the performing arts. Femi Otitoju founded the Challenge Consultancy in 1985, a company which designs and delivers training solutions for big clients about diversity. She will be doing a fantastic presentation workshop afterwards on unconscious bias, and I hope you can all stay for that. And Kelly Webb-Lamb is Deputy Director of Programmes for Channel 4 and the Head of Popular Factual. Kelly Webb-Lamb, I'm going to have to start with you because I remember when I first saw some of the early work that Sam had done with Channel 4, and we came out as the poshest broadcaster in Britain. I don't know whether, like me, you were embarrassed or ashamed of that.
I took part in Sam's research, as did many people at Channel 4. So I would say, first of all, I wasn't surprised. It is embarrassing, but it is just true. I think that the truth of it is that it's an industry that's posh, and you know, when that research was done, Channel 4 came out as the poshest, and obviously there's no, how can you possibly be anything other than embarrassed by that? Since that, so that was 2 years ago, we have actually, looking at your list of things that should be done, the channel is doing most of them, and in terms of monitoring the class backgrounds, we've continued to do that, and we have seen a kind of significant improvement, but it's still not good enough. And to me, I guess the thing that matters to me, look, I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a politician, and though I completely agree with you that it's unfair, for me this is about creativity. It's about telling stories that everybody can relate to. It's about properly representing the whole country on screen. And I don't see how we're ever going to do that as successfully as we want to if we don't change the people in the industry.
What is particularly difficult for Channel 4, and we'll come on to the other broadcasters because they have a case to answer too, is I remember from the Victorian days when Channel 4 was created, and it was all about being an alternative, not being the establishment. And it tells you perhaps how bad things are if Channel 4 itself is the poshest broadcaster in Britain.
It does, and I think that the irony of the whole thing is that, you know, anybody that knows people who work at Channel 4, and I definitely include myself in this, there is a kind of commitment to challenge, to diversity, to provocation, to telling diverse stories, sort of that runs through. There's a massive pride in the remit within the building, and there's a great irony about the fact that that sits alongside who those people are. And I think, you know, that that's just where we are, and we need to, you know, the things that Sam suggests that we do, I think are interesting, and actually lots of them we have done. To me, there are sort of hard and soft recommendations and hard and soft points, and I've read the whole book. I kind of swallowed it, to be honest. No, I did. It was utterly brilliant and really fascinating. But for me, the hard things, which are about money and getting in and Bank of Mum and Dad, in some ways, those are the things that are easier to solve. I think it's the soft, and we are doing a lot of them, the soft things around fit and culture and studied in format. Those are the things that are hard.
One of the very interesting things in the book, Sam, I'm going to ask you to be brief because you've had a lot of to say, but I want, you know, that idea of how merit is defined in the creative industries, that's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why I'm really interested to hear the panel's view on it. But I think there's this sense in which what we think of as merit in occupations is often this sort of historical residue of who have been the sort of people who have done that work in the past, how over time has their idea about the right way to work and to be in the workplace become embedded and institutionalized over time. So I think, you know, we have to sort of understand and then pick out and try and say, well, what elements of that sort of historical residue do we want to hold on to, because we think actually can be sort of legitimately connected to work performance or to good program making, and what other bits are just basically cultural baggage.
Femi, you're shaking your head at that.
I'm shaking my head and nodding at the same time because merit is such a fluid thing and it's so subjective. And some of the indicators that people say to me, oh yes, she's earned that, she got it on merit. And what they mean is that she was here the whole time, all day. And what that means is she had a life that meant she could do that. She didn't have children, or she had someone else who was going to look after her children, or she didn't have to do another job in order to be able to do this one. So it looks like merit, but actually it's privilege again. And that's the problem. We need to look at what actually constitutes merit and ask ourselves whether it's genuinely so, or whether actually that person has that wind behind them.
And Louise, I mean, you know, it's the creative industry, so, you know, we're here to be creative, darling. Does merit have a similarly sort of subjective dimension in the sort of more structured organisations you look at?
Yes, absolutely. It's no different in many ways. It's equally as subjective. And believe it or not, the kind of professionals that I work with often think they're deeply creative and innovative too. So maybe they are. I wouldn't be the person to deny that or not. So yeah, highly subjective, tends to be defined by people who are already in positions of power and influence, and they tend to identify merit in people who are quite similar to them, the kind of people that they recognise. One of the important points about merit, which has been picked up already, is what constitutes merit is very rarely made explicit. So people kind of go, oh, I know it when I see it. Now, if they actually had to write down the factors that constitute merit, it would be very difficult to justify. So as one example, CEOs of leading FTSE 100 companies tend to be male, and they tend to be much taller than the average. Now, if you actually wrote that down in a job description, you need these competencies, but also be male and be very tall, you couldn't justify that. And I think we see that again, that if you actually force people to really identify what historically has looked like merit, as I say, it becomes very difficult to justify.
And Tracy, you've been involved in two clubs, if you like,
Indeed.
acting and now the Houses of Parliament.
It was very interesting when we were doing the Acting Up report, which I'd urge people to have a little look at as well, because it's very specific about the creative industries. Merit came up on a number of occasions. What is merit? So when we had Cush Jumbo, you may know from The Good Wife, being told at drama school that she had a lazy South London accent, her merit wasn't spotted. She had to go to America for her merit to be spotted. And when you have casting directors being told by production companies, we want diverse casting in this production. And I don't know if any of you saw the previous series of Broadchurch, where obviously the casting director had been told diversity was a priority because even some of the smaller characters, as well as some of the leads, were actually quite a mixed bag of accents and ethnicity. And it's a political will. That's what merit is about. And if you have drama schools, people, my youngest is today having her first audition for Central, so it feels very pertinent at the moment. But if you have people who are making those decisions at drama schools of who has merit, but they themselves come from a white privileged background, they have a different sphere of what merit actually looks like. And certainly when it comes to the news and Channel 4, if you come from a town rather than a city, where sometimes there are these programs set up where big companies do great work, outreach to the north, and they outreach to the cities, to cities in the north. So Sheffield, Manchester, Leeds, there might be opportunities for youngsters there. But I would say the towns are getting a really rum deal. And just to blow my own trumpet just for 30 seconds, after the Acting Up report, the National Youth Theatre understood that charging for auditions and then you have to live in London for the summer scheme was not attracting kids like mine in Batley and Spen. They gave us free auditions and a bursary for kids who got in. And I was thinking, God, I hope somebody's got the talent, because this will be really embarrassing. We'd just done an amazing production of Les Mis with West End professionals, so our talent was, you know, they'd got good experience. We got 9 kids in, 3 actors and 6 backstage, and anybody who's ever applied to the National Youth Theatre or knows anything about it will know that is an extraordinary number for a small town like a community like Batley and Spen. So we need the opportunities to get the skills that give us the merit, but we also need that broader understanding of what merit actually is. And certainly I would also very quickly say I've been to Channel 4 on a number of occasions, and the women are also very tall.
I think our heightism is a whole different issue, which we'll come back to. Some of my best friends are short. My husband's only 5'5", and he's going nowhere. Kelly, do you have to redefine merit and how it's measured?
I think, first of all, we have to ask what merit is in telly, because I think, and I'll be honest and say, I think that's actually really hard, because to do that, to take it away from all of these things that Sam's raised, we have to look at measures of success. And it is, and if you read the book, people do say this, and I do think it's a valid point, which is that the measures of success in telly are totally unscientific. So there just isn't a science around which idea is going to be a hit. You don't know. So nobody knows. The data can't tell you that. And so actually how to kind of decide who is good at making those decisions is tricky. And the measures of success in telly also often are in absolute conflict with each other. So, for example, programs that win awards might have the teeny tiniest number of people watching them. So if your measure of success in telly is you want big audiences, that's really important to us as a broadcaster, you could say, okay, well, this person who commissioned this show or made this show or whatever, I mean, it's also complex because there's so many people and the productions are huge, but that might be in direct conflict with whether it's a good program. And then that's also in conflict with whether it's commercial, did it make money, which is also in conflict with did it speak to the remit, did it make noise, did it go to press? The measures of success are complicated and they are contradictory.
Honestly speaking, isn't one of the difficulties, and please feel free to come in on this, is that question of merit, because it's so vague, then fits in nicely with that issue of fitting in, who fits in. So the people who look like us or look like the very tall white bosses
and I think that's why there needs to be somehow, and I have to be honest and say I think this is tricky, but I think we need to do it exactly as Sam says, a proper debate around what talent and merit is, because what the problem with where we are at the moment is that if you come from a particular background, you jump through all of these hoops, right? So all of the things that Sam talks about in the book about Bank of Mum and Dad and about informal sponsorship and about fit and all of those things, if you come from a particular background, all of those things are easier for you, which means it's much easier for you to get to a particular place, which means that that particular place is filled with people who are all the same.
And then when you get there, go
ahead, please.
And then when you get there, it was difficult for you to get there in the first place, but the other thing is that you don't actually know what the rules are once you're there.
Yeah.
So then if you're from outside of the dominant culture there, you first of all got to work out what the rules are, and then when you've worked out what they are, then you have to work out whether or not you're prepared to play the game in order to get there. And what we need to do, we're talking about codes, what we need to do is to get, not just have the debate about what merit is, but also to have, to tell people who are coming in what that looks like.
So what do the individuals have to find a way of fitting in, of understanding the code, or should the organisations change?
The organisation needs to decide whether it needs to change. Some things are essential. For example, I went to one organisation and was talking about culture, and somebody there said, well, and I won't say who it was, but they said, well, the newsroom's a bear pit, and if you can't cope in a meeting, in an aggressive meeting, then you're not going to make it. Well, in that situation, I said, I think the bear pit needs to change. In other places, you just need to tell people what they need to be like. So you might say, look, here, as one client said to me, we're intellectually playful. like to be part of that. Or in other places, they might say, we welcome, you know, overt and robust challenge in public forums. So if that's what you want, tell me, and then I can decide whether or not I want to do it.
I think.
Can I just very quickly say, I think merit is also experience. And it's about having the confidence to articulate your thinking. Can you imagine in a commissioning meeting, if you've just come from, you know, Batley or whatever, and you have no experience, how on earth could you have the confidence to speak? So the problem, certainly for Channel 4, is more of a global problem when it comes to, for example, local newspapers closing all over the country. Where do youngsters who don't go to university get their experience in the media? You know, they don't have the opportunity. Local radio is sort of hanging by a thread. There needs to be those opportunities for experience, and certainly there has to be more investment in careers advice, where these are the organisations you can go into, and this is what is expected of you.
I just wonder, in terms of organisational change, though, we have to be realistic about how organisations work, and they very often would say, we need people in who can get going straight away. So how do we change that business of choosing the people who fit in?
Yeah, we have to have an element of pragmatism, I think, in this debate. So going back to the idea, do we fix the individual or do we fix the organisation? We absolutely have to do both. And for a long time, we can kind of learn lessons from gender, for example, here. The focus was predominantly on fixing women in order that they could fit into dominant cultures, and it just didn't really work on the whole. So we do have to focus on fixing the organisation too, but we have to recognise that that will take a long time. It really doesn't happen overnight. But we have to expose how arbitrary and how pointless many of these kind of codes of conduct are, and how little they actually contribute to the functioning of the organisation.
I think also that, you know, in many of the things that you're talking about, Tracy, actually, as a channel, there is an enormous amount of work being done on that. So all of our pop-ups this year were in the most deprived cities and towns in the country, not all cities, some towns. We have got apprentice schemes that are only for non-graduates. We do support people financially if they have to come to London for those programmes. We have stopped all informal and unadvertised internships. So things like that the channel is doing. I think the question about the culture is a really tricky one, and who should change is really hard, because look, I'll be honest and put my hands up and say, I'm glad I work in an informal industry. I'm glad I don't have to be corporately polished, but it's the studied thing that's the problem, right? So it's about, and those things are hard. So should we be saying to people, here are the sort of rules that you can't see when you can't?
Absolutely, we should be telling people the rules. And if they then aren't skilled enough to be able to meet them, then we should be supporting them so that they can. So when someone said, you know, I've done really well, I've got all these apprentices from working class backgrounds, Femi, we're very pleased, but I'm terrified that one of them will go into a meeting and split an infinitive, and someone's going to put them down really badly. And then, you know, we'll lose them. They'll just think this is not the place for me. So we've actually got to not just train them and equip them, but we've also got to train the people who are going to form the environment that they're going into, so that they treat them appropriately.
I think the thing for, you know, the thing that's tricky for us as a channel compared with the BBC, let's say, for example, is that we don't produce anything. So when you look at the stats across the BBC compared with Channel 4, because the BBC is a huge producer, the entry-level positions are very different to what they are in commissioning. The reality is that to become a commissioner, you have to already be at a very senior position within telly. So there's a sort of how to those, everything that you're saying, which I just completely agree with, because I know myself when I got to Channel 4 that I was really aware of that, but I was able to learn those rules really quickly, and nobody did tell me. And in my very first creative breakfast that I went to, which is a meeting of the kind of senior commissioners to talk about ideas, as I walked out of that meeting, somebody said to me, well done, you fitted in really well. And it has stayed with me ever since. But I was able to do that, but I was already very senior at that point. I'd run an indie. So I think we have to, within the industry, so I think it's that how you get everything that we're doing as a channel about entry level doesn't actually get created into Channel 4.
And
So
I mean,
it's an industry
figures on
problem. It's an
executives in
industry
Channel 4
problem.
were absolutely appalling. I mean,
Yeah.
they were staggering in terms of how few people from a working class background arrive at that point.
Yeah.
And I wonder, just Sam or Tracy, you know, this issue of fitting in, is there, I mean, your report paints it really nicely, you know, with one of your case studies from a major broadcaster who says, you know, he went into the morning meeting and he recognised it straight away because it was like private school, it was like Oxbridge Common Room. How do you change that instinctive draw of bosses, the people who are hiring, to think this person will fit in straight away? How do you change that?
Well, I mean, I think this has been really interesting hearing people's take on how you deal with this amorphous idea of merit. I think the only thing I would add to that, which perhaps would begin this process, is if you have a firm-wide conversation, but that conversation isn't necessarily led, you know, to be fair, in the way that we're doing it today, which is by those at the top to some extent, and you actually are bringing in voices and properly including and listening to those voices from throughout the organisation who are in very junior positions, then I think that sort of contestation then perhaps speaks to those at the top in ways that then make them realise that some of the things that they're doing in that environment yeah, no, go ahead.
Is there a difficulty that the people at the top, by their very nature, and the stats would confirm it, don't think it's an issue for them because they're all right already?
But exactly, and I think, but that's why you have the conversation. I mean, just to say, I mean, I had lots of interesting conversations post this research with people at Channel 4, particularly about this idea of highbrow culture and whether it's necessary. And I think there's an interesting, you know, we're saying, I don't think there's a connection there with intelligence or ability or a lot of the programs being made. But I think there's a discussion to be made. I can see that there's an interesting you know, position to say, well, actually, those references, that culture does help to make good programs. Let's have that conversation and properly have it debated by everyone. But rather than what's happening at the moment is the assumptions of those individuals, by default, because of their position, carry weight.
Yeah, I mean, fitting in is a real issue. Certainly, as when I was an actor, starting out, council estate, very broad Yorkshire accent. I never, in 30 years as an actor, played a character who wore a suit. And now I'm an MP. And my agent, who still says, oh, I'll represent you, I'm like, I've finished. She said, Tracy, when you finish, you can play all those big parts now because people believe you can take that authority and play it's like bonkers. And I've decided after this conversation that anybody who goes anywhere near these big creative organisations should watch Monty Python and learn it off by heart, because that seems to be a way to fit in. I think the conversation is also about the gatekeepers, and certainly in the creative industries, it's about the writers and the voice. And James Graham, who you may know, just took the West End by storm last year, the Labour of Love and lots of others. I mean, he was saying we need those working class voices because then they have to cast working class actors, and then people start getting excited about those narratives, because actually, if you don't have those stories landing on the table, how do you get those programs made? And the gatekeepers then can see, actually, this is a potential, it's a great idea, money spinner, but actually, it's just from a different narrative and a different voice. And certainly, I think there's lots done on the diversity from black writers and so on, but I think that socio-economic voice is still not, in my opinion, breaking through.
Louise?
Yeah, just some general points on fitting in. So it was a really, really interesting discussion, and I completely agree. There are some factors that might be relevant to your creativity and innovation that we shouldn't forget. But on the other hand, I think what we do see is people in senior positions feeling more confident to say, well, I managed to fit in, I learnt the rules, and therefore other people can do that too. It's not that hard. And I think sometimes that can be a sort of post hoc rationalisation. People forget what it was like for them. They forget that it's different now, potentially, and they forget perhaps how exhausting and distracting and ultimately quite pointless that process can be. So I do think that idea of kind of more reverse mentoring, kind of having some kind of experiential approach to this is really useful as well.
But also you can make it statutory in the way that we've got more women in Parliament now, and because those women in Parliament have made changes. And for example, only last week, I don't know if anybody saw the pictures of Tulip Sadiq in her wheelchair, and she changed the date of her cesarean in order to fit in with a major vote. I mean, this is bonkers. Proxy voting is now in place, and it makes sense. If Naz Shah had to be brought in an ambulance in her hospital pyjamas on a drip to a vote from Bradford to London, it's bonkers, and it impacts on family life, and it impacts on your mental health, and you know, it just doesn't make sense. So the more women you get, for example, into an organisation, the more that they will campaign for change. But it is about the political will. All women shortlists, it forced the Labour Party to change, and it's one of the proudest things of my life to see the diversity of our front bench. All sorts of people from diverse backgrounds and working class backgrounds, but it is because we force change, and so it is possible, but you do need people who are politically have skin in the game to change it.
But can I just add that we do need to think about power and interest here. So these things don't arise out of nothing for no reason. The people who often will support the status quo have highly vested interests in supporting the status quo, and often with diversity and inclusion, which is a very apolitical, neutralised agenda, quite problematic in that sense. It's almost that we're too shy. We think it's rude to talk about power and interests, but they're absolutely evident. And so often we talk about what we can do and how we can change, but we don't talk enough about why people will be encouraged to do that. And that is, in my view, one of the biggest barriers to change.
And if we're talking about interest, we have to make it in people's interest to do well around social diversity. So you can't be seen as doing your job well unless you can show how you've contributed to our aims in that area. And then they're interested, then watch them walk around to working class people asking how they're doing and whether there's anything they can do to help them.
And that's often, I would also say, we use the business case here predominantly to drive change. The business case is not useful, as it's perhaps useful as a narrative, but most of the research says that what actually motivates middle managers, the people who have most to lose, if you like, from these changes, to actually implement changes, is they want to look good and they don't want to look bad. So that sounds cynical, but it is proven to be a more effective lever than this kind of rather abstract idea of a notional business case, which might become real at some point in future.
But if bosses are measured by it,
yes,
that would make a difference,
yes,
wouldn't it, presumably?
And if the culture means that if they do not respond to those levers, they do not look as good, that is proven to be more successful
And
than
just
other levers.
I was just going to say, to me, I hear you say that, and I think, well, that is the business case, rather than saying to people, you've got to do this because it's right or it's fair. Yeah. I think the thing that's hard is saying to people, you've got to do this because it's the right thing, because that doesn't. What has to happen is exactly that. People have to understand that they won't do well at their job, they won't be rewarded, they won't be promoted. But if they don't, rather than,
it's not good enough to say this is fair, this is right. As a driver, I agree, obviously, but I think you know, everything that Sam's research shows says that we know that people protect their own interests first, and if you've got a good job, you want to keep your good job, and that is humanity. For me, in telly, I think there's two things. One is exactly that you're saying, but the other is, I think we also have to somehow. It's about genuinely doing our jobs to the best of our abilities. And I just think if all the people, or the vast majority of the people who are making the creative decisions, I don't just mean at Channel 4, I mean across the industry, pretty much have similar lives and come from similar places, we aren't going to have as creative, exciting, different, diverse content as we want. And that is in a really changing landscape where the whole of telly is changing. The way that people consume content is changing. The way that people watch, when they watch, what they watch is changing. We have to, and that is a business case, yes, but we have to keep up if we want to continue to be brilliant. And that, to me, that's a really important message. But it's also important that you're scrutinised, isn't it? I mean, I know poor old Channel 4's got a right bashing. I mean, I remember 15...
But look, we've done it, right? We've published the research. We did that first. Yeah. I'm really glad we did that. I'm really glad that Sam came in. I'm really glad that people spoke openly. I think that, like with Me Too or the gender pay gap, you know, once those things are out there, they're out there. We can't put it back now.
But I do think you are leading the way, Liz. I'm really, really chuffed with what you've done, because hopefully that will then shame other broadcasters into it. And you can't do anything without the numbers. The gender pay gap was in the news and changes were made because they were forced to do it. And I absolutely agree with you. Whilst it is embarrassing, at least you're putting things in place where, you know, things can change. I would pick up the one thing, that whilst we're talking about getting in and getting on, it's staying in is also difficult. And I'm sure there are women in the room here that have been in these big organisations and they have a family and then they go right back to the start again, and we're losing all that talent. So it's the leaky pipeline as well as the getting in that's also an issue.
And I mean, that's a, you know, that is a huge industry issue. At Channel 4, actually, many people at Channel 4 actually have jobs. In the industry, most people don't have jobs. They're freelancers. And that makes having kids really difficult. That means if you don't have the support of your parents, if you're suddenly out of work for a few months, really difficult. That means if you have to go home at a particular time because you can't afford to pay a nanny and you have to pick your kids up from nursery, really difficult. The freelance nature of the industry is a problem, and, you know, a huge problem. But,
I feel slightly, you know, Channel 4 was taken an absolute hammering, and one might argue rightly so. But, you know, the BBC, other broadcasters, there's a job of work to do there too, isn't there?
They'll follow suit.
And being honest and open about the numbers is critical, isn't it, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think my view on this is that Channel 4 have been incredibly brave and actually are leading the way. I mean, there's probably a decision that was made in the process of actually commissioning the research, of knowing that there was going to be something in this that they were going to have to sort of own. And I'm just incredibly impressed as an organisation. And, you know, Louise and I work with lots of organisations in this space, and I can tell you not all organisations have been willing to be as transparent and open about this. And the reality is, in relation to television, is that most of the drivers that you see, or we found at Channel 4, are industry-wide. And they are about the structure of careers in television, and they are also about behavioural codes that have some organisation-specific elements, but are also hugely evident in other areas of the industry. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and hopefully what you get here is this sort of domino effect. And I agree, some of the levers, particularly government, you know, you see the success of mandatory gender pay gap reporting, is that it has lent this sort of name and shame or this accountability element that has driven change, because there is scrutiny now on those organisations. I can't see any reason why you couldn't have the same thing happen with a class pay gap.
I just want to add to what Sam said, that we're talking about organisations here, and that's actually where my research is focused, but we're talking about this in a wider context of social mobility in the UK. And I think it's really important that while organisations often get a bashing here, and there is more that organisations can do, many of the solutions to social mobility are inherently political, and to some extent I would say that it's useful for the government to suggest that they're not, because that directs attention away from the really important issue of inequality. So I just want to make that point, that political solutions are very important.
Just before, I'm really hoping to throw this out to the audience, so be ready if you have questions or thoughts. But on that point, would you be nervous about government intervention on this as a business?
In what way?
Well, in terms of, you know, a much greater focus being forced to, I mean, you have come out with the numbers, but industry-wide, monitoring social mobility, making sure, I don't know, quotas, anything that might, in a sense, force the industry. And
we want legislative change, don't we? We want legislative change.
I think sorry, carry on. Overexcited.
It's just that, you know, there's only 9 protected characteristics, and that's not right. Mm-hmm. And socioeconomic background was part of initially.
I mean, personally, I completely agree with that. I think that classes, you know, is, because it isn't a protected characteristic, is often left out in conversations about diversity. And I think that the work on intersectionality that Sam talks about in the book, I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but it was something like, if you're a working class black woman, you're paid 20%, I think it was, less than a white middle class man. Yeah. You know, those things, exactly. And so I've always felt that the fact that class is left out of the protected characteristics, well, it just simply doesn't really make sense. I sort of assume it's because it's hard to measure, but you know, for us, we are now using Sam's criteria. That's that definition. That's how we are continuing to monitor. And if that was across the whole industry or across the whole country, but we're doing that for us. That's our first step.
Can I just add as well, I really want to reiterate the point that this is absolutely a political problem. The lack of social mobility is about social inequality. And certainly as the Shadow Minister for Early Years, that you can see that disadvantage in the under fives that will stay with them all their life. And certainly when it comes to the creative industries, we have a responsibility as legislators to ensure that working class schools that have a catchment of working class kids have the same access to creative subjects.
But how do you legislate for that?
But
How do you force it?
you can work. First you have to be in government, but you can also push. Ofsted, and actually there has been some slight movement last week about the whole person, that the creative subjects dropping out of the curriculum because of the EBAC and being told that they can be hobbies instead of actually being embedded in the curriculum. Often those creative subjects are a magnet for those kids who may not be the most academic, and they're also free therapy for kids who are already struggling with various things at home, and also they haven't got the money or the transport facilities to get to these hobby out-of-school events. We have to make it a level playing field where, no disrespect to those young people who went to Eton, but if they've got an on-site theatre with a full-time technician, or two theatres, they know.
And they're very tall.
Yeah, but those parents have paid for that added enrichment because they know that creative engagement enables their child to be more flexible, more creative problem solver, more empathetic, and all of those really positive soft skills that we're talking about. Whereas, my predecessor, Jo Cox, took, I think it was Osborne, Cameron and Boris to Darfur. And she said it was really funny, Tracy, because they were all sat in the room and they all went to the same school. And Jo and I went to Hepburn White Grammar. And she said it's like the whole of the front bench have been to Hepburn White Grammar. And you think, yeah, actually, it is these amazing schools enrich those young people to have these skills where they can go into any job and be articulate and confident. So we can legislate by making sure that right at the beginning we have a level playing field.
And we do have to go in much earlier, don't we? I'm struck by some of the schemes that we have at work. They're just too late. You have to show young children from...
I think they are too late, and actually one of the things that I think, just on your point, Femi, about teaching people the codes that I thought was interesting, I've been looking at Twitter in response to the book, is that I think there's this thing in schools, that this is one example, but in schools at the moment, and certainly my kids, and they went to our local school, there was a whole discussion about sixth form, and should kids in sixth form wear business dress? And I was like, I don't know whether that's right or appropriate, because there are so many industries where business dress is not what actually you need to wear, and it's the middle class kids who know that. They know it's okay in certain circumstances to turn up in jeans and trainers because they have lived in those places their whole lives. And so I think we do all of those things. It has to start from the beginning. You have to give people opportunities to sing and dance and act. You have to give them... So it's very difficult, but then, if I'm honest, I then come back to that same question of who has to change. Yeah. Who, and that is a really tricky question.
It's not really that tricky, because saying we need legislative change, saying that organisations need to change, that's the long game. And while I'm the teenager trying to get into the industry, do I just sit here on the outside waiting for it to change and then I can pop in? No, we change the industry, but we also need to support each individual person. So, yeah, there's the political, but as the feminists like to say, there's also the personal that we need to look at too.
Just very quickly, Femi, I think what I'm particularly interested in is, yes, those people need to change, they need to get, but I suppose what's interesting, hopefully, about this sort of research is it then arms them with some critical sort of data that they can then, once they're in, can start to challenge those things.
And just very, very quickly, one of the things I do is I spend a lot of time evaluating social mobility initiatives that young kids are coming through, aged maybe 16, 17, in my experience, mainly into the city. And one of the things that happens in those initiatives is those children, those kids, are sold a narrative, a very individualistic narrative, where they're told that their social identity won't matter, it will have no bearing whatsoever on their career, and any just talent and hard work will be enough for them to succeed. And it's a terrible disillusionment to them when they move through the labour market and realise that's not true. So I do think there's we have to change organisations and cultures, but we do have to be pragmatic as well and recognise what those barriers are as well.
Now, I'd like to, slightly earlier than planned, throw this out to the audience. I'm hoping there's still an audience there because I literally can't see anybody. I'm going to do my poor man, stroke poor woman's Fiona Bruce here. If I can see a hand up, I might need some lights up actually. If you can identify who you are and if your question is to anyone in particular. Brilliant. Oh my God, you're still here. Gentleman at the front.
Simon Albury Campaign for Broadcasting Equality. I've got two quick things. I was fascinated by Sam's chart. ITV appeared to be better than the other broadcasters on social class. And yet there is a paradox, because on the Ofcom data, it is worst on BAME employment. Now, a lot of people suggest that if you deal with the class issue, you're dealing with the BAME employment issue. But that chart and the Ofcom data would suggest that that isn't correct. And I'd be interested to hear the panel's view on that. And I have a question for Tracy. There's been a lot of talk about being honest on the data, and yet the broadcasters don't publish programme diversity data. And I hope Labour will commit to giving Ofcom the power to get that data and a requirement to publish that data, because actually we're in the dark.
And certainly, can I just say, the Writers Guild are doing fantastic work trying to find numbers of women writers, and they're forced to go through the Radio Times and just try and pick out where the women are. This data is absolutely vital, and we know that data equals political change. So it's vital they have the teeth for that.
And Louise, you were shaking your head when the suggestion about the BAME.
Sam should probably answer this one, but very quickly, I think if I understand your question, it's very problematic to make an alignment between BME and social class, and to think that if you're ticking the BME, because what we tend to, in the city where I, as I say, do most of my work, what we tended to see 10 years ago was firms using BME as a proxy for social class, and it turned out that they were slightly diversifying on ethnicity, but the demographic profile of those people was not dissimilar to the people that were making up the culture predominantly, and I think it's similar in...
Yeah, and just to say very quickly on that, I mean, when you look nationally, the class composition of different black and minority ethnic groups is incredibly diverse. So I think it's very problematic to put those two things together. You might sometimes see that those things, you know, as I showed, that there's intersectional issues, but I think it's a sort of problematic connection to make. And actually what's interesting is to sort of understand, and we show there's a couple of graphs in the book that show the class makeup of different black and minority ethnic groups in the UK, and they are very different.
Okay, there's a question right at the back. The lady with glasses, woman with glasses.
Hi, it's not really a question, but it's just something where I thought it would be really great if everybody was able to leave the room actually being able to do something themselves, as opposed to kind of some of this is above lots of pay grades in the room. I'm from ScreenSkills. We do a whole range of things in terms of skills and training, and there are things that we are doing where we could do with help of anybody here. We do, the careers team go out, and we've engaged with 32,000 young people in exactly the way, talking about careers in the industry. We've done 32,000 in the last 6 months. We always need people to talk about jobs. We're about to launch a kind of a standardised mentoring service, because we all know that the networks really matter. So we're going to try and recruit thousands of mentors for every level. So from, you know, for new entrants to get support from people just a bit further on, for middle, you know, executives to get support from higher executives. So whatever level you are, we will need that. And also there's just one other thing, that in terms of some of these opportunities, quite often people need placements. So, for example, at the moment, we're supporting a programme that Directors UK are doing for directors. It's got a very good track record in terms of women. And actually, sometimes we find it difficult to find the placements. So there are kind of things that everybody in this room can do, as opposed to kind of leaving it all to Tracy. You can...
She's very capable. Yeah.
Although she's very good. So giving back at screenskills.com if you want to, or just get in touch.
Get in touch after this if you want to. 3 over here, if possible. brutally quick, I'm afraid. I'm trying to get as few.
Hello, Anne Henry, TV producer. I was really interested in what you said about making class a protected characteristic. If you could talk a bit more about how that might work and how far you would go. Would you make being a parent a protected characteristic? Would you make being shorter a protected characteristic? Which is where it gets very real for me because I'm 6'1", so be kind.
Well, I think being a parent is sort of in there in a way. There are some protection already for caring. There is some protection for caring responsibilities, and I'd like to kind of start from the other end instead of going, well, you lot have a banner and go on a march, and then we'll give you a law, and each group trying to get a law for their own interest. I'd rather start from the other end and say, you should not be treating people less favourably for things that are unrelated to the job that you're recruiting to. Let's start there, and then see where we go from that.
2 towards the back, 3. If you can, sorry to... Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to steal it from you. Yeah, we'll come back to you. Sorry.
Thank you, hello. Just a very brief comment initially on merit. Just want to say and agree with Femi really that I don't think the same rules are applied where merit is concerned and minority groups are concerned. Seems to be lots of things are forgivable if you are of the right group, you know, white, male, middle class. I won't use a TV example, but if we think of Chris Grayling at the moment, failing Grayling, you know, all is forgiven if you're the right kind of, if you've got the right kind of look. My question, though, is about, we are very well trained. We've been on apprenticeship schemes. We've been mentored. Where do we go after that? What happens when we've got the experience and we are, you know, we want to go further than just the apprenticeship scheme?
Is that one for you, Kelly?
In telly, do you mean? In this industry? I mean, from a broadcasting perspective, that's very difficult because, as I said, commissioning is significantly, you know, most people come into commissioning from having been execs or at least series producers. I think that the truth is it's really hard. I think the way that, because it is an informal industry, because people are freelancers, if you have got those experiences from apprenticeships and internships, that is a brilliant start. When I used to run an independent production company, and honestly, the thing to do is to just contact people, keep contacting them, keep contacting them, keep contacting them, because it is, there are, you know there are advertised jobs, but I think that as a channel, our jobs are advertised. I mean, Sam talked about that being kind of, that process is actually quite tight now for us as a channel. You know, all of our jobs are advertised. There is a proper open process, but those are really senior jobs, and the industry is a whole other question.
Very briefly,
which
are you
is
saying
very
that
informal.
informal avenue for you still has to exist with its flaws in terms
I'm
of...
not saying it has to exist. I think it would be
just a
brilliant
question.
if it. I mean, no, but if there was a way to formalise the industry more broadly, that would change everything. That's not, as a channel, we operate in a different way to the industry as a whole. The industry as a whole does still, it is because things are project by project. That's the trouble, is that if you're an indie, you don't know whether this one commission you've got, once that's finished, are you going to have work for people? And therefore you hire them for that one project. And that's a very tricky thing to get around. So taking a risk on hiring somebody even for a year, if the project is 2 months long, is a massive risk. And therefore we have an industry that works project by project, and it makes it very difficult.
And then we'll come back to
Another one for Tracy, if that's okay. I'm a production manager at Channel 4 News, but I also work for an education blog, and I just really I found it very interesting that you touched on the EBAC. And I know you can't answer for Ofsted, but as an MP, if we're talking about tackling this class dichotomy from the source, what is happening and is enough happening to tackle the favouritism shown to that curriculum in the education system?
Well, just I picked out some figures before I came here, and just this is deeply shocking, that arts GCSEs have dropped 35%, design and tech 39%, arts A-level 24%. We're losing drama teachers hand over fist. We have to tackle that understanding about what makes a whole person, looking at the future of work, and it has to be quite strategic, that we need to build back in the creative subjects for every child, and have it quantifiable for the world of work going forward. And Ofsted have said that we will now look at behaviour of children as part of their outstanding and so on. Now, this isn't anybody's party policy, but I don't think you should be an outstanding school without any arts provision. This is just my own personal opinion. We have to ensure that our young people are prepared for the world of work.
I mean, as Femi says, that is then the long game, though,
Yes,
isn't it?
it
We
is.
need to look at what we can do now.
But for example, we can all take a particular mission. I'm fundraising. I've got a fundraiser with Keir Starmer for a living wage working class intern in my office. And let me tell you, I've had a whole heap of crap about it, because people are saying, well, why can't you've got a budget, employ them on that budget. The budgets for staff, for MPs, are incredibly tight, and you can't take somebody on a high salary that has no experience and would be no use to you at the start. You have to be able to grow that talent. So I'm saying to my community, let's walk the walk rather than talk the talk. Back me and get this working class intern in my office.
Sorry, I know there's loads to say on that. I'm really sorry. I've got 3 or 4, I hope, in the next 5 minutes. The lady who waited very patiently.
Emily Hodgson from the Social Mobility Foundation. I just wanted to know from Sam or Louise if there are any lessons you've seen in terms of progression from other industries. So I know you talk about in the book medicine, incredibly hard to get in, but is it easier to get on, for example, and whether there's anything that can be learned and transferred to this industry?
I'm sort of slightly struggling, to be honest. The area of progression is fairly new for most organisations. Louise might know a little bit more about this. I mean, one thing I was just thinking, and it relates slightly to your question and also to the question before about sort of what do you do once you've got that apprenticeship. It does seem to me when I was looking at television that there's a particular mid-career issue, particularly if you are somebody who's trying to traverse that tightrope of the creative route, and you sort of necessarily have to negotiate a whole string of poorly paid, precarious production style jobs that, you know, in terms of interventions and charities and broadcaster support, something that scaffolds that mid-career and allows people who don't have the bank of mum and dad, perhaps through subsidy, perhaps through some sort of support mechanism financially, to actually take the plunge and go for those jobs, that then gives them the experience to then get those top positions. I think that would be really useful. I mean, it's interesting that actually the TV festival runs one of those, which I think is really successful, the Ones to Watch scheme, that sort of does that mid-career job of helping to propel people and doesn't necessarily rely on people having to have parental resources to be on it.
Louise, if you want to pick this up very quickly, and then we'll probably only have time for 2 more. The ladies wait very patiently, the woman in the purple and then the grey top, Georgia.
It will be very quick because there isn't an awful lot to say, because thinking about the impact of socioeconomic background and those intersections in relation to career progression within organisations is quite new. So we don't have an awful lot of evidence. In fact, it's really difficult to get evidence for what works in diversity and inclusion, as with any other HR practice, because we have a problem with correlation and causality that I won't go into in detail now. But I would say that we can learn lessons from other diversity strands. So that's something to look at, and probably haven't got time to discuss that now.
Right. Hi, I feel like I'm the target market for this because, you know, I come from a free school meals, unemployed, single parent council estate, northeast background. And I'm a freelance AP in factual TV and have been so for 9 years. And I'd like to talk to all of you about so many areas on which I have thoughts, fascinating stuff. But I think a big issue is staying in the industry. And partly I'm wondering, I think budget is a diversity issue, and I'm wondering whether you think so too. Low wages are predominant on the most prestigious contracts, days here and there, so getting a stable place to live is hard, and many other associated issues. And I think this kind of links to Kelly's theme for the Edinburgh Festival, like the Edinburgh TV Festival. What is TV for? How can we get bigger budgets in TV? Because the media is a national communication system. I think this will motivate top managers too, maybe, because that slow thinking and quality that a bigger budget would help.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name?
It's Zena.
Zena. Well, I mean, Zena makes so many points illustrating why it's so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I completely appreciate, I was an AP for many, many years myself, and it is a really precarious industry. I think what Sam's talking about how as an industry we address that bit of people's careers, particularly when you then have women who have kids. I mean, I know myself that there are so many brilliantly talented women who the industry have just lost because they have babies and then they can't do it anymore because the industry doesn't support them, and it's tragic. And I, myself have tried many things, none of which have been particularly successful in my own small way, about looking at different ways, you know, can you do job sharing in the edit? What are the ways in which we can try to change the way that the industry works? The bigger budgets question is a very difficult one. TV is extremely expensive. It costs a huge amount of money to make an hour of television. I don't know. Sorry?
I'm going to have to.
Okay.
Speed you up, I'm sorry.
The bigger. I think I don't know whether bigger budgets is the answer. I wonder whether actually, how do we monitor what people are actually paid for the work they do is a slightly different question.
This is the last question, I'm afraid, because I'm already cutting into your tea break.
I work for Channel 4 News as well in the digital team, the deputy head of digital there with Jackie, and I have one of the privileges of my job is that I get to give jobs to young people, which is very rare in our industry. And I'm very aware of this, but I think, I wonder what can we do at a really practical level, like me tomorrow when I go into an interview, to think about these things, because as a gender issue or a race issue, it's much clearer to you when they walk into the room what you're dealing with. What do I do tomorrow when I interview someone to make sure that I'm thinking about this, but also thinking about all those other things, and also getting the right person in for that job in their mid-20s.
Sam, Louise, any thoughts? Big size.
God, it's very hard to be able to give you something off the top of the head without knowing you exactly how it works. But I mean, you could be seeing before they get in the door. I think it's slightly problematic to be asking them about their class backgrounds in those interviews. But you can be providing them with something before that means that you have that information before they're in the door. And then I think feeding that into the way in which you make decisions about who it is, and having armed with that demographic information before you go in, because that's the point, right? You're saying with some of these other characteristics, you kind of know that when they move in, when they walk in. With this, it's really important and difficult to see, so you sort of need to have a mechanism that allows you to see it in the way you can see those other characteristics.
Louise, last word to you. Femi, you might pick up on some of that in your next thing anyway.
More and more organisations are using contextual data in the recruitment process to help them flag issues such as social class, which aren't necessarily visible, and that can play a really important role. But they're also, for example, and none of this is a panacea, of course, but they're changing, for example, from competencies to strengths to give people from a variety of backgrounds use the full variety of their experience to demonstrate what they're good at, which doesn't involve doing kind of Duke of Edinburgh or whatever else it might be that might be quite classed. It means they can take their job in the local shop or whatever it is and use that to demonstrate their strengths. So those kinds of small nudges, and we do talk about nudges, kind of behavioural insights, that kind of thing can point you in the right direction. So that's something to look at, I think, in terms of what to do in the room.
I'm really sorry we're going to have to end it there. If this was Channel 4 News, we've just broken into 2 breaks. So I want to thank the panel who've been absolutely fantastic. There is so much more to talk about. Maybe they'll do another one. That's not me looking for another gig. But thank you very, very much for coming. And I hope we continue to talk about this. Thank you.